The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored paper that felt expensive between his fingers. David couldn't believe he was holding it. After 3 years of running a small community center in the poorest part of town, he finally got invited to the city's biggest charity event. The Golden Heart Foundation's annual gala was where the wealthy gathered to write big checks and feel good about themselves. David borrowed his brother's best suit, which was still 2 sizes too big. He adjusted his tie for the 10th time as he walked through the marble lobby of the Grand Plaza Hotel. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, and every surface seemed to sparkle under the warm lights. Felt like he was walking through a movie set. The ballroom doors opened, and David's breath caught in his throat. The room was enormous, filled with round tables covered in white silk. Fresh flowers that probably cost more than his monthly rent sat in the center of each table, in it perfectly. Tailored suits chatted casually, while women in designer dresses glided across the polished floor like they owned the world. David found his table near the back, far from the stage where the important people would speak. He recognized the name cards around him, other small charity workers, community volunteers, people like him who were invited to fill seats and make the event look diverse and caring. The woman sitting next to him smiled warmly. "First time here?" she asked, noticing how David kept looking around the room with wide eyes. "That obvious?" David laughed nervously. "Don't worry, I felt the same way my first time. I'm Linda. I run a food bank downtown." "David, I have a community center on 5th Street. Linda nodded knowingly. "The real workers always get the back tables. The big donors sit up front where the cameras can see them." Before David could respond, the lights dimmed slightly, and a murmur went through the crowd. Everyone turned toward the main entrance, where a small group of people had just arrived. Even from across the room, David could see they were different from everyone else. They moved with purpose, creating a bubble of space around them. "That's her," Linda whispered. "Isabella Montenegro. She's the reason this event exists." David watched as Isabella made her way through the crowd. She was tall and elegant, wearing a deep blue dress that probably cost more than David's car. Her silver hair was pulled back perfectly, and she carried herself like royalty. 3 men in dark suits followed her closely, their eyes constantly scanning the room. "Are those bodyguards?" David asked. "Personal security," Linda corrected. "When you're worth $500 million, you don't take chances." Isabella stopped at nearly every table, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. David noticed how people's faces lit up when she approached. She had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. Even if she only spoke to them for 30 seconds, she's actually done a lot of good, Linda continued. Her foundation has donated millions to causes around the city. But ... She paused, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Let's just say she likes to make sure everyone knows about her generosity." David watched Isabella work the room like a professional politician. She posed for photos, laughed at jokes that probably weren't that funny, and seemed to remember everyone's names. The 3 security guards stayed close, but tried to blend into the background. The evening officially began with a welcome speech from the foundation's president. David learned that Isabella had started the Golden Heart Foundation after her husband died using his insurance money to help others. The numbers were impressive. Millions donated. Thousands of families helped. Dozens of community programs funded. When Isabella finally took the stage, the room fell completely silent. She spoke about compassion, about the responsibility that comes with wealth, about making the world a better place. Her words were beautiful and inspiring. David found himself genuinely moved by her passion. "Every dollar we raise tonight will go directly to those who need it most," Isabella said, her voice carrying easily through the microphone. "That's my personal guarantee." The crowd erupted in applause. David clapped along, feeling hopeful about the evening for the first time. During dinner, David noticed small things that made him uncomfortable. When a young waiter accidentally knocked over a water glass near Isabella's table, she didn't just ignore it. She made a comment loud enough for others to hear about hiring better help. When an elderly volunteer tried to thank her personally for funding his senior center, she cut him off mid-sentence to answer her phone. Most telling was how she treated the kitchen staff. David went to the restroom and passed through a service area where Isabella was speaking harshly to the catering manager about the temperature of her soup. Her voice was cold and demanding, nothing like the warm, caring tone she used with the donors. "I don't pay premium prices for mediocre service," she snapped. "Fix it, or I'll find someone who can." The catering manager, a middle-aged woman who looked like she'd been working since dawn, just nodded and apologized repeatedly. David felt his stomach turn. As the evening progressed, David overheard conversations that made him realize how different his world was from theirs. People casually mentioned their vacation homes, their private jets, their children's expensive private schools. They talked about charitable giving the way David talked about grocery shopping, as just another item on their weekly to-do list. But it was during the silent auction that David's discomfort turned to something else entirely. Was looking at the items up for bid: weekend getaways, expensive jewelry, exclusive restaurant experiences, when he overheard Isabella talking to two other board members near the auction table. "The community center allocation can be reduced by 30%, Isabella was saying quietly. "Those people don't track the money carefully anyway. We can redirect it to the hospital wing project. Much better publicity for us." David's blood ran cold. She was talking about cutting funding to places like his community center, places that served the poorest families in the city, places that desperately needed every dollar they could get. "What about the promised amounts?" one of the board members asked. Isabella waved dismissively. "We'll tell them there were unexpected expenses. They'll understand. Besides, what are they going to do? Complain publicly? They need us more than we need them." David stood frozen behind a large floral arrangement, his heart pounding. The woman who had just given a beautiful speech about helping those in need was casually discussing how to steal money from the very people she claimed to serve. The evening suddenly felt very different. Crystal chandeliers looked cold instead of elegant. Expensive dresses and suits seemed like costumes. And Isabella Montenegro, the generous philanthropist, had just revealed herself to be something else entirely. David spent the rest of the evening watching Isabella with new eyes. Her smile seemed forced now, her laugh too loud. When she posed for photos with small charity workers like himself, he could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was playing a role, and everyone in the room was her audience. As the evening wound down, David knew he had to do something. The community center served over 200 families. If their funding was cut, children would lose their after-school programs, seniors would lose their daily meals. Families would lose their only safe place to gather. But what could he do? He was nobody special, just a guy who ran a small program in a forgotten part of town. Isabella Montenegro was one of the most powerful people in the city. Her security guards alone probably made more money than David did in a year. Still, as he watched her accept another round of applause for her generous heart, David made a decision. He couldn't let this slide. Somehow he had to find a way to confront her, even if it meant risking everything he'd worked for. The golden cage was beautiful from the outside, but David had just seen what was really trapped inside. David couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Isabella's cold voice talking about cutting funding like it was nothing. He kept thinking about little Amy, who came to the community center every day after school because her mom worked 2 jobs, or old Mr. Peterson, who relied on their senior lunch program because his Social Security barely covered his rent. The next morning, David sat in his tiny office at the community center, staring at the funding letter from the Golden Heart Foundation. It promised $25,000 for the year money that would keep their doors open and food on the table for the families they served. But now he knew that promise meant nothing to Isabella Montenegro. His phone buzzed. It was Linda from the food bank. "Did you hear?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. 3 community programs got their funding cut this morning. All golden. Heart Foundation grants. They're calling it budget adjustments. David's stomach dropped. "Which programs?" "The youth center on Oak Street, the senior meal program in Riverside, and the family shelter downtown. They're scrambling to find other funding, but you know how hard that is." David knew exactly how hard it was. He'd spent countless hours writing grant applications, making phone calls, and practically begging for money to keep his programs running. Most foundations were already stretched thin, and finding new donors was like searching for gold in a coal mine. "Linda, I need to tell you something," David said, and then told her everything he'd overheard at the gala. There was a long silence. On the other end, finally, Linda spoke. "David, you know what this means, right? She's stealing from the poorest people in the city." "I know, but what can we do about it? She's Isabella Montenegro. I'm just some guy who runs a community center." "Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person to do something," Linda said. "You're not trying to protect a reputation or a career. You actually care about the people this affects." After hanging up, David spent the day thinking. He watched the kids in the after-school program doing their homework, helped Mrs. Rodriguez fill out job applications, and listened to teenagers talk about their dreams for the future. These weren't statistics or tax write-offs to him. They were real people with real lives, and Isabella was about to make those lives much harder. By evening, David had made his decision. He was going to confront Isabella Montenegro directly. Finding her wasn't as hard as he'd expected. Isabella's schedule was surprisingly public. She attended board meetings, charity lunches, and social events almost every day. Her assistant's voice was polite but firm when David called her office. "Ms. Montenegro's schedule is completely full for the next 3 months," the assistant said. "However, I can schedule you for a brief meeting in December." December was 8 months away. By then, half the community programs in the city would be closed. David decided to try a different approach. He learned that Isabella had lunch every Tuesday at the same upscale restaurant. Downtown, a place called the Sterling Room. It was the kind of restaurant where a sandwich costs more than most people's daily food budget, but David used his savings to buy a decent shirt and made a reservation. The following Tuesday, David sat at a corner table, nervously checking his watch. He felt completely out of place among the business suits and designer handbags. The menu prices made his head spin. $30 for a salad, $50 for a piece of fish. At exactly 12:30, Isabella arrived. She looked even more intimidating in daylight, wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. Her 2 security guards took a table nearby, their eyes constantly scanning the room. David waited until Isabella had ordered her food, then took a deep breath and walked over to her table. "Ms. Montenegro? I'm David Chen. I run the 5th Street Community Center. I was at the gala last week." Isabella looked up with the same practiced smile she'd worn that night. "Of course. How wonderful to see you again. I hope you enjoyed the evening." "I did, thank you. I was wondering if I could speak with you for just a moment about something important." Isabella's smile never wavered, but David caught a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. "I'm afraid I'm quite busy today. Perhaps you could call my office and schedule something." "I tried that. They said you're booked until December." "Well, then December it is." Isabella turned back to her phone, clearly dismissing him. David felt his courage starting to slip away, but then he thought about Amy and Mr. Peterson and all the other people counting on him. "Ms. Montenegro, I overheard your conversation at the gala about cutting funding to community programs." She set down her phone and looked at David with sharp, calculating eyes. "I'm sorry, what?" "Talking about reducing community center funding by 30%. About redirecting the money to other projects?" For a moment, Isabella just stared at him.
Ow.
Then, like flipping a switch, her charming smile returned. "Oh, you must have misunderstood. We're always looking at ways to maximize our impact. Sometimes that means reallocating resources where they can do the most good. But these programs are already doing good, real good, for real people." Isabella laughed, but it sounded forced. "Of course they are, and we'll continue to support them as much as we can. But surely you understand that we have to be responsible with our donors' money."
Oh.
David felt his frustration building. "The families at my center aren't asking for anything extra. They just want to keep the programs they already have. Programs you've promised to fund. Promises change, Mr. Chen. Business realities change. I'm sure someone with your ... background understands that life isn't always fair." It's the way she said background made David's skin crawl. There was something condescending in her tone, like she was talking to a child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. "This isn't about fairness," David said, his voice getting stronger. "This is about honesty. You stood up at that gala and told everyone their money would go directly to helping people. But you're planning to steal it." Isabella's face went cold. The fake warmth disappeared completely, replaced by something much more dangerous. "Mr. Chen, I think you should be very careful about the words you use. Accusations like that can have serious consequences. Are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you. You seem like a nice young man who cares about his community. It'd be a shame if something happened to your funding because of a misunderstanding." David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She was openly threatening to destroy his program if he didn't keep quiet. "People are depending on these programs," David said, his voice shaking slightly. "Children, elderly people, families who have nowhere else to go." Isabella picked up her phone again, her voice becoming bored and dismissive. "The foundation will continue to support worthy causes as we see fit. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have important calls to make." She didn't look at him again. David stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her dismissal. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet buzz of conversation and clinking silverware. Isabella's security guards were watching him now, their message clear. As David walked back to his table, he realized something important had just happened. Isabella had dropped her mask completely. She'd shown him exactly who she really was, someone who would steal from the poorest people in the city and then threaten anyone who tried to stop her. She'd also made a mistake. She'd assumed that David would back down, that he'd be too scared or too small to fight back. She'd underestimated what a person would do when everything they cared about was on the line. David left the restaurant, knowing that this was far from over. Isabella Montenegro had just declared war on him, and he was going to have to decide whether to surrender or fight back. The problem was, he had no idea how to fight someone with her kind of power. One thing was clear, he couldn't let her win. Too many people were counting on him, and he wasn't going to let them down, even if it meant risking everything he'd worked for. David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Over the next few days, he noticed the same black car parked across from the community center. When he went to the grocery store, he saw a man in a suit who seemed to be following him. It could have been his imagination, but Isabella's threat kept echoing in his head. The breaking point came on Friday afternoon. David was helping kids with their homework when his phone rang. It was the bank. "Mr. Chen, we need to discuss your community center's account. There seems to be a problem with your foundation grant." David's heart sank. "What kind of problem?" "Golden Heart Foundation has requested a hold on all fund transfers. They're claiming there are irregularities in your program documentation." David knew this was Isabella's doing. She was already starting to make good on her threat. But instead of backing down, it made him more determined than ever to expose her. That evening, David decided to gather evidence. He remembered Isabella mentioning the hospital wing project during her conversation at the gala. If he could prove that money was being diverted from community programs to projects that would make her look good, maybe someone would listen. He spent the weekend researching. Public records showed that Isabella was on the board of Mercy General Hospital, and they were indeed building a new wing. The Golden Heart Foundation had just announced a $5 million donation to the project. David did the math. If Isabella was cutting 30% from all community programs, that would free up exactly $5 million. Monday morning, David called a reporter he'd met at a community event. Jennifer Park worked for the local newspaper and had written about neighborhood issues before. "I've got a story that could be big," David told her, "but I need your help to investigate it properly." Jennifer was interested but cautious. "What kind of story?" "Charity fraud. Someone stealing money meant for the poorest families and using it for personal gain. That's a serious accusation." "Do you have proof?" David told her everything. The overheard conversation, the confrontation at the restaurant, the sudden hold. On his funding, Jennifer listened carefully, asking detailed questions. "This is compelling, but I need more than your word," she said. "Can you get me documentation?" "Financial records? Something concrete?" David promised to try. But getting access to the foundation's internal documents would be nearly impossible. He was thinking about his options when his phone rang. It was Linda from the food bank. David. Something strange happened today. One of Isabella's security guards came to see me. Said he wanted to talk about what you overheard at the gala. David's blood ran cold. What did he say? Seemed ... conflicted. Like he wanted to tell me. Something but was afraid. He said his name was Tony, and he's worked for Isabella for 3 years. He asked me to give you his number. David stared at the phone number Linda had given him. Could this be the break he needed, or was it another one of Isabella's tricks? That evening, David called Tony. The man's voice was quiet and careful. Can you meet me tomorrow? Somewhere private? There are things about Ms. Montenegro that you need to know? They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in a part of town where neither of them would be recognized. David spent the night wondering if he was walking into a trap. The next morning, David arrived at the coffee shop early. Tony was already there, sitting in a corner booth. He was younger than David had expected, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes and a nervous manner. Thank you for coming, Tony said as David sat down. I wasn't sure you would. Why did you want to meet me? Tony looked around the coffee shop, making sure no one was listening. Shh. I heard about what happened at the restaurant. Miss Montenegro told us you were trying to cause trouble for the foundation. You believed her? At first, yes, but I've been working for her for 3 years. I've seen things. Tony paused, struggling with something. She's not the person people think she is. What do you mean? Tony pulled out his phone and showed David a video. I recorded this last week. She didn't know I was there. The video showed Isabella in what looked like her office, screaming at someone on the phone. Her face was twisted with rage. She was using language that would have shocked the people who saw her as a refined philanthropist. She was talking to a contractor who was behind schedule on her personal home renovation, Tony explained. Told him she'd make sure he never worked in the city again if he didn't finish by her deadline. Why are you showing me this? Tony looked uncomfortable, because I've been telling myself that she's just demanding that successful people have, to be tough. But after what happened with you, I started paying closer attention. She's not just tough, she's cruel. Tony showed David more videos and photos on his phone. Isabella berating staff members, throwing objects when she was angry, making racist comments about people when she thought no one was listening. The worst part, Tony continued, is how she talks about the people her foundation is supposed to help. She calls them those people and welfare cases. She sees them as props for her public image, not as real human beings. David felt sick. Why haven't you said anything before? Because I need this job. I have a family to support. But when I saw what she was doing to the community programs, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. Tony leaned forward. There's something else. Ms. Montenegro is planning something big. Tomorrow night, there's a board meeting about the budget changes. She's going to announce the cuts to community programs and present them as necessary cost-saving measures. Can you get me into that meeting? I can't do that, but ... Tony hesitated. I might be able to help you in another way. She's having a private dinner party tomorrow night before the board meeting. All the major donors will be there. If you could somehow get in there... David's mind raced. Would you help me? Tony was quiet for a long moment. If I do this, I'm risking everything. My job, my reputation, maybe even my safety. I know, but think about all the people who will suffer if we don't stop her. Tony nodded slowly. Okay, but we have to be smart about this. If we're going to expose her, we need to do it right. They spent the next hour planning. Tony would create a distraction that would allow David to slip into the dinner party. David would try to record Isabella when she was speaking freely to her wealthy friends, away from the public eye. There's one more thing, Tony said as they prepared to leave. Be careful. Ms. Montenegro doesn't just destroy people financially. She destroys their reputations, their relationships, their entire lives. She's done it before. David felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? 2 years ago, a city council member started asking questions about the foundation's spending. Within 6 months, he was facing corruption charges, and his political career was over. The charges were eventually dropped, but the damage was done. Think she framed him? I think Ms. Montenegro is capable of anything when she feels threatened. And right now, she sees you as a threat. David walked home feeling like he was walking toward a cliff. Tomorrow night, he would either expose Isabella Montenegro's corruption or destroy his own life trying. But when he thought about Amy, Mr. Peterson, and all the other people counting on him, he knew he didn't have a choice. The shameless act was about to begin, and David was about to learn just how far someone would go to protect their power and wealth. He just hoped he would survive long enough to tell the story. David's hands were shaking as he adjusted his borrowed waiter's uniform. Tony had managed to get him a catering job for Isabella's dinner party, complete with fake references and a temporary ID badge. The plan was simple but dangerous. David would serve drinks and try to record Isabella when she spoke freely to her wealthy friends. The dinner party was at Isabella's mansion in the hills, a massive house that looked like something from a magazine. Even the driveway was longer than David's entire street. Tony met him at the service entrance looking nervous. "Remember, keep your head down and don't draw attention to yourself," Tony whispered. "She's already on edge because of the board meeting tomorrow. If she recognizes you—" "I know," David said, checking that his phone was recording. "Where will she be? The main dining room first, then probably the study for private conversations. That's where she always takes the big donors when she wants to discuss business." David nodded and picked up a tray of champagne glasses. His heart was pounding so hard, he was sure everyone could hear it. The dining room was even more impressive than the hotel ballroom. Crystal chandelier that must have cost more than David's. Annual salary hung over a table that could seat 20 people. The guests were exactly what David expected. Wealthy. Well-dressed people who looked like they'd never worried about paying rent or buying groceries. Isabella sat at the head of the table, wearing a stunning red dress and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was talking animatedly about her latest charity project, but David could hear the calculation in her voice. "The hospital wing will be our crowning achievement," she was saying. $5 million that will save countless lives in cement. Our foundation's reputation as the city's premier charitable organization. An older man in an expensive suit raised his glass. "To Isabella, who proves that smart business and generous hearts can work together." Everyone toasted, but David noticed that Isabella's smile looked forced. She was playing a role, just like at the gala. As David served drinks, he listened to conversations that made his stomach turn. These people talked about poor neighborhoods like they were discussing zoo animals. They used phrases like "those people" and "the unfortunate class," as if poverty was a choice rather than a circumstance. The key, Isabella was explaining to a woman with diamond earrings, is to give them just enough to feel grateful, but not so much that they become dependent. We're teaching them to help themselves. David had to bite his tongue. The families at his community center weren't looking for handouts. They were working multiple jobs, going to school, trying to build better lives for their children. Isabella made it sound like they were lazy and ungrateful. After dinner, just as Tony had predicted, Isabella led a smaller group to her study. David managed to follow, carrying a tray of coffee and dessert. The study was lined with books that looked like they'd never been opened and awards that Isabella had clearly arranged. "For maximum impact? Now that we're among friends," Isabella said, closing the door behind them, "let's talk about the real business." David positioned himself near a bookshelf where he could hear everything while pretending to dust. "The board meeting tomorrow is just a formality," Isabella continued. "We're cutting the community program funding by 30% across the board. It's money that was being wasted anyway. What about the programs that are actually working?" asked a man David recognized from the gala. Isabella laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Define working. These programs keep people comfortable. In their poverty, instead of motivating them to improve their lives, we're doing them a favor by forcing them to find other solutions." David felt his anger rising. She was talking about cutting programs that fed hungry children and provided safe spaces for teenagers. Programs that gave elderly people their only social interaction of the day. Programs that helped families learn English and find jobs. "Besides," Isabella continued, "the hospital wing project will generate much better publicity. When people see our name on a beautiful new building, they'll remember us. A soup kitchen in the projects. Nobody remembers that. What about the community workers who might complain? Asked the woman with the diamond earrings. Isabella's expression turned cold. They won't be a problem. I've already dealt with one troublemaker, a man named David Chen, who runs some little community center. He thought he could threaten me, but I've made sure his funding is frozen and his reputation is being questioned. David's heart stopped. She was talking about him like he was nothing, like destroying his life's work was just a minor inconvenience. How did you handle it? The man asked, sounding impressed. Simple. I had my people spread the word that his financial management was questionable. A few phone calls to the right people, and suddenly everyone's wondering if he's been stealing from his own programs. By the time I'm finished with him, he'll be lucky to get a job anywhere in this city. David felt sick. She wasn't just cutting his funding, she was destroying his reputation and making sure he could never help anyone again. That's brilliant, the woman said. Discredit the messenger so nobody listens to the message. It's not the first time I've had to protect the foundation from troublemakers, Isabella said with a satisfied smile. Remember that city council member who started asking questions about our spending? He's selling insurance now, poor thing. Tony had been right. As Isabella didn't just defeat her enemies, she destroyed their entire lives. The conversation continued, but David had heard enough. He had everything he needed to expose Isabella, her own words, spoken freely to her wealthy friends, showing exactly who she really was. But as he started to leave, disaster struck. David's phone, which had been recording the entire conversation, slipped from his pocket and crashed to the floor. The sound echoed through the quiet study like a gunshot. Everyone turned to look at him. For a moment, time seemed frozen. Then Isabella's eyes widened with recognition and rage. You, she said, her voice deadly quiet. What are you doing here? David's mind raced. He could try to pretend he was just a waiter, but Isabella was already standing up, her face twisted with fury. Get him, she snapped to Tony and the other security guard. But Tony didn't move. He stood there, looking conflicted and scared. I said, get him, Isabella screamed. That's when David realized that Tony wasn't the only one having second thoughts. The other security guard, a man named Ray, who David had seen at the gala, was also hesitating. Ma'am, Ray said carefully. Maybe we should, don't think, Isabella interrupted. Just do your job. But something had changed. The mask had finally slipped completely. The wealthy donors in the room were seeing Isabella's true face, the screaming, raging woman who had been hiding behind charity work and social graces. Even they looked uncomfortable. David saw his chance, grabbed his phone from the floor, and ran toward the door. Behind him, he could hear Isabella shouting orders that no one seemed eager to follow. He made it to the hallway before Ray caught up with him. But instead of stopping him, Ray whispered, the back exit. Go now. David ran through the mansion's corridors, his heart pounding. He could hear Isabella's voice echoing through the house. It's no longer the refined philanthropist, but a woman who had lost all control. He burst through the back door and into the night, still clutching his phone with its precious recording. Behind him, the mansion was erupting in chaos. Isabella Montenegro's perfect world was finally cracking apart. But David knew this was far from over. He had the evidence he needed, but Isabella had more power and resources than he could imagine. Real battle was just beginning. David drove through the night with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The recording was safe on his phone, but he knew Isabella wouldn't just let this go. She had too much to lose and too much power to use against him. His phone rang as he pulled into his apartment complex. It was Tony. David, you need to be careful. She's lost her mind. She's calling everyone she knows, trying to figure out how to stop you. What's she saying? She's telling people you broke into her house, that you're some kind of stalker. She's already called the police and filed a report. David felt his heart sink. Even now, Isabella was 2 steps ahead of him. What should I do? Get that recording to someone who can protect you. A lawyer, a journalist, someone with power, and do it fast. David spent the rest of the night copying the recording to multiple devices and cloud storage accounts. He wasn't going to let Isabella destroy the evidence like she'd probably done before the next morning. David called Jennifer Park, the reporter who had shown interest in the story. Her phone went straight to voicemail. When he tried her newspaper, they told him she was out of town on assignment. Desperate, David decided to take the recording directly to the police. But when he arrived at the station, the desk sergeant looked at him with suspicion. "You're David Chen? We've been looking for you?" David's stomach dropped. "Looking for me? You're wanted for questioning about a break-in at Isabella Montenegro's residence. She says you threatened her and broke into her home." David couldn't believe it. Isabella was already using the system against him. "I have evidence of charity fraud. She's stealing money from community programs." The sergeant looked skeptical. "Ma'am, you can tell that to the detective. But right now we need to talk about last night." Just as David was about to be taken into custody, his phone rang. It was Linda from the food bank, and she sounded excited. "David, turn on Channel 7 News right now." "At the police station." "I'm at the police station." Isabella called them and just trust me. "Tell them to turn on the news." David looked at the sergeant. "Can we watch the news for just a minute?" "Please." The sergeant rolled his eyes but turned on the TV in the waiting area. Channel 7 was just starting their noon broadcast. "Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Martinez with breaking news. We've received explosive recordings that appear to show prominent philanthropist Isabella Montenegro discussing the misuse of charitable funds." David's jaw dropped. The reporter was playing portions of his recording from the night before? But how did they get it? His phone buzzed with a text from Tony. "Ray copied the recording before you left. He sent it to the media." We couldn't stay silent anymore. On the TV, Isabella's voice was crystal clear. "We're cutting the community program funding by 30% across the board. It's money that was being wasted anyway," the reporter continued. "In these recordings, Ms. Montenegro appears to admit redirecting funds meant for low-income community programs to a hospital project that would provide better publicity for her foundation." David watched in amazement as the story unfolded. The news station had done their research overnight. They showed the budget numbers, interviewed families who relied on the community programs, even got statements from other foundation board members who claimed they had no knowledge of the funding cuts. The sergeant was watching too. Attitude toward David was clearly changing. "Is this what you were trying to tell us about?" "Yes, I recorded that conversation myself. I can prove I was there legitimately. Within an hour, everything changed." The police dropped their investigation of David. When it became clear that he had been working as a legitimate catering employee, Isabella's break-in claim fell apart when Tony and Ray both came forward as witnesses, but the real shock came when other people started speaking up. A former foundation employee called the news station with documents showing financial irregularities going back years. A city council member who had been investigating the foundation before his political career was destroyed came forward with evidence of Isabella's intimidation tactics. Most powerful of all was when the wealthy donors from the dinner party began distancing themselves from Isabella. The woman with the diamond earrings gave an interview saying she was shocked and appalled by what she'd heard. The man who had praised Isabella's business sense was now calling for a full investigation of the foundation. David watched it all unfold from his community center, surrounded by the kids and families he'd fought so hard to protect. Isabella's empire was crumbling in real time. The turning point came when the Attorney General announced a formal investigation into the Golden Heart Foundation. Isabella's assets were frozen, and she was banned from operating any charitable organizations. Pending the outcome of the investigation, but Isabella wasn't going down without a fight. She held a press conference where she tried to present herself as the victim of a conspiracy. She claimed that David was a disgruntled former employee who had fabricated evidence against her. "I've devoted my life to helping others," she said, tears streaming down her face. "This is a coordinated attack on my character and my foundation's good work. It might have worked if not for one thing." Ray, her own security guard, stood up during the press conference and spoke directly to the cameras. "I worked for Ms. Montenegro for 4 years," he said. "I've seen how she really treats people. Everything in those recordings is true. She never cared about helping anyone but herself." The sight of her own employee contradicting her in public was the final blow. Isabella's lawyers quickly ended the press conference, but the damage was done. Over the following weeks, the investigation revealed the full scope of Isabella's corruption. She had been siphoning money from community programs for years, using it to fund projects that made her look good to wealthy donors. The hospital wing, the scholarship program, even the foundation's fancy offices, all paid for with money that was supposed to help the poorest families in the city. The community programs that had been cut were quickly restored, with additional funding from donors who were horrified by what they'd learned. David's community center received enough money to expand their services and hire more staff. But for David, the most satisfying moment came when Amy, the little girl who came to the center every day after school, gave him a drawing she'd made. It showed him standing in front of the community center with a big smile, surrounded by all the kids and families who came there. "Thank you for saving our place," she said simply. Isabella Montenegro was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and theft. Her mansion was sold, and the money was donated to the community programs she had tried to destroy. The Golden Heart Foundation was dissolved. Its remaining assets were distributed to legitimate charities. Tony and Ray both found new jobs with security companies that appreciated their honesty. They told David that speaking up was the hardest thing they'd ever done, but also the most important. David learned something valuable from the experience. He discovered that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one with the most money or the biggest house. Sometimes it's the person who's willing to stand up for what's right. Even when it's scary, the community center is still there on 5th Street, busier than ever. Mr. Peterson still comes for lunch every day, and Amy still does her homework at the corner table. They probably don't know that they almost lost it all. That's okay with David. He kept the recording on his phone, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that shameless people like Isabella Montenegro exist in the world, but so do people like Tony and Ray, who chose to do the right thing when it mattered most. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.